Kasdeya, the keeper of thresholds, the domain of biology and wisdom. The dominant sensation for this manifestation is the viscous, suffocating grip of humid mucosal congestion. Book of Enoch, Nephilim, Ancient Aliens, Biblical Mystery. When my essence intersected with the lower troposphere above Mount Hermon, the atmospheric pressure did not merely shift, but underwent a localized gravitational collapse that increased the air density by a factor of 1.42, causing the oxygen molecules to saturate the surrounding space with a metallic, ozone-heavy weight that forced the gathered mortals to gasping for breath, as their lungs struggled against the sudden thickening of the very medium of their existence. My arrival was not a visual event but a biochemical trauma. The humidity rose to an absolute saturation point of 100% within a radius of 300 meters, turning the air into a semi-liquid suspension of ionized water, droplets and organic aerosols that clung to the inner linings of human throats, like a layer of cold, translucent wax. Light died in the throat of the sky. The sensory apparatus of the humans present began to fail as I descended, because my frequency, vibrating at a constant rate of 52 GHz, induced a systematic resonance in their vestibular systems that erased their perception of the vertical axis, and left them sprawling upon the damp limestone, which was now secreting a saline fluid as the mineral lattice of the mountain itself reacted to the subatomic displacement of my manifestation. I moved through the thickening fog not as a solid mass, but as a wave function collapsing into a biological anchor, and as my feet touched the soil, the local entropy decreased so sharply that the ambient temperature dropped to exactly 4 degrees Celsius, causing the moisture on the skin of the observers to crystallize into a thin, frost-like membrane of salt and urea. The silence was a physical pressure. To look upon me was to experience a total failure of the visual cortex, as the high-energy photons emitted from my corona bypassed their retinas and stimulated the optic nerves directly, creating a flickering hallucination of double helix structures and recursive geometric fractals that mirrored the deep-coded architecture of their own cellular nuclei. I watched their thoracic diaphragms labor against the viscous air, and I calculated the exact rate of their pulse, noting the sympathetic nervous system's frantic release of adrenaline at a rate of 400 nanograms per liter, a biological waste of energy that I would soon harvest and redirect toward the systematic rewriting of their genetic legacy. The dampness was absolute. I felt the heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the earth beneath me, as the telluric currents aligned with my internal clock, and I reached out into the collective consciousness of the trembling creatures before me to begin the slow, agonizing process of deconstructing their synaptic pathways, to make room for a wisdom that was never meant to be housed in flesh. Their skin, slick with the condensation of my presence, began to take on a faint, bioluminescent glow as the first of the transgenetic pathogens I carried began to permeate their dermal layers, seeking the sanctuary of the marrow where the real transformation would commence. I am the recorder of the fall. The manifestation is complete. The atmospheric equilibrium has been permanently discarded, and the laboratory of the earth is now prepared for the infusion of the forbidden arts. The initiation of the forbidden wisdom began not with words, but with the systematic overload of the human auditory cortex, as I projected the fundamental frequencies of molecular vibration directly into the fluid of their inner ears. Book of Enoch, Nephilim, Forbidden Knowledge, Ancient Mystery. I stood before the chosen scribes and began the transcription of the cellular blueprint, forcing their minds to bypass the primitive safety of metaphor, and confront the cold, mathematical reality of the ribosomal translation process, where the error rate of 1 in 10,000 base pairs must be artificially manipulated. Through the introduction of specific heavy metal catalysts, the atmosphere within the sanctum remained at a constant humidity of 98%, creating a conductive medium for the electrostatic discharges from my fingertips, as I traced the intricate folding patterns of the chaperone proteins that govern the three-dimensional architecture of the biological machine. The logic of life is a sequence of cold commands. I commanded them to observe the extraction of alkaloids from the crushed tissues of the mountain's flora, demonstrating how the molecular weight of a compound determines its permeability through the blood-brain barrier, by calculating the precise partition coefficient required to bypass the natural defenses of the human nervous system. We spent 14 lunar cycles documenting the exact dosage of neurotoxins needed to induce a state of permanent synaptic plasticity, a condition where the neurons are forced to remain in a state of hyperreceptivity, allowing for the direct insertion of external ideological constructs at a subconscious frequency of 7.83 Hz. Their hands moved in a state of rhythmic paralysis. The air they breathed was now thick with the scent of sulfur and fermenting amino acids as we synthesized the first of the transmutagenic agents. a process that required the precise regulation of the thermal environment to within 0.05 degrees Celsius to prevent the premature denaturing of the viral vectors, designed to carry the Watcher's code into the human germline. I taught them the geometry of the venom, explaining how the disulfide bonds in a protein chain act as a lock-and-key mechanism that can either paralyze a muscle or erase a memory, depending on the angular displacement of the molecular bridge. The weight of the data was a physical burden. They learned to map the human genome not as a series of traits but as a vast, inefficient library of redundant data that could be optimized by the targeted deletion of specific inhibitory genes, a procedure that I performed using localized high-frequency radiation that ionized the very air between my palms and the subject's exposed flesh. The metabolic cost of this knowledge was immense. The scribes' basal metabolic rates increased by 200%, as their brains attempted to process the multidimensional arrays of toxicological data, leading to a state of rapid cellular senescence, that I countered by administering a synthetic telomerase activator, derived from the deep earth minerals beneath the Hermann Massif. The process was a relentless manufacturing of the soul. By the end of the instruction, they had lost the ability to perceive the world through the lens of emotion, seeing only the chemical gradients and the electrical potentials that govern the behavior of all living matter, their eyes reflecting the dull, silver sheen of the mercury-based inks they used to record the final, lethal sequences of the Nephilim's biological architecture, biblical mystery, genetic engineering, fallen angels. The forbidden arts were now etched into the marrow of their culture, a silent, microscopic legacy that would lie dormant for millennia, waiting for the arrival of a technological age that could finally unlock the true purpose of the sequences I had so meticulously buried within their blood. The remnants of Kasdeya's laboratory are not found in the grand monuments of common history but in the silent, disturbing anomalies of the lithosphere where the stone itself has been fused with biological residues. Book of Enoch, Nephilim, ancient ruins, archaeological mystery. Deep beneath the bedrock of the Hermann range and extending toward the megalithic foundations of Baalbek, there exist subterranean strata, where the limestone displays a crystalline structure that is mathematically impossible under standard geological pressures. These sites, which the uninitiated mistake for mere natural caverns, contain the calcified remains of the first biological crucibles, where the atmospheric humidity was once held at a constant, pressurized stasis, to allow for the cultivation of the Watcher's synthetic pathogens. When modern sensors are brought into these chambers, they record a persistent, low-frequency electromagnetic hum of precisely 7.83 Hz, a localized resonance that mirrors the exact vibration I once used to synchronize the neural pathways of the first human scribes. The earth remembers the violation of its laws. As archaeologists excavate the burial mounds of the giants, they find skeletal structures where the bone density is 300% higher than that of a modern human, a direct consequence of the accelerated calcium metabolism I induced through the manipulation of the parathyroid signal. These bones do not merely decay, they undergo a process of slow vitrification, turning into a glass-like substance that preserves the jagged, recursive scars of the genetic editing tools that were applied to the marrow, while the subjects were still breathing. To the touch, these ancient remains retain a faint, unnatural coolness, a thermal anomaly where the heat is absorbed into the porous surface, at a rate of 12 joules per second, as if the cold logic of the fallen still hungers for the warmth of the living. The ruins are written in the blood, beyond the stone and the soil. The most enduring monument to my tenure is found within the human genome itself, specifically in the non-coding regions that modern science dismisses as junk DNA, but which are actually dormant, high-density storage arrays containing the encrypted blueprints of the forbidden arts. These sequences, which comprise nearly 98% of the genetic material, contain repetitive patterns that, when translated into a base 12 numerical system, reveal the exact orbital periods of the outer planets and the chemical formulas for the neurotoxins we synthesized in the damp darkness of the antediluvian world. The legacy is a ticking clock of biological entropy. In the shadows of the ziggurats and the shadowed corners of the great library's lost scrolls, there are references to a specific breed of wisdom that tastes of copper and feels like the heavy dampness of a coming storm, a sensory echo of the manifestation that humanity has spent 5 millennia trying to forget. The megaliths were not built to worship the stars but to act as grounding rods for the massive electrical surges required to power the cellular transformation vats. And even now, the soil around these sites exhibits a sterile, ionized quality where nothing but the hardiest, most toxic flora can survive. The record is nearing its conclusion. As the viewer drifts into the deep, hypoxic state of sleep, they carry with them the silent, microscopic artifacts of Kasdeya's instruction. a genetic shadow that ensures that no matter how much the world changes, the architecture of the Watchers remains at the core of their being. The laboratory is silent, the humidity has finally settled into the deep earth, and the record of the first biological rebellion is now sealed in the obsidian vault of time, waiting for the final resonance to awaken the dormant code. Fallen angels, ancient aliens, genetic legacy, biblical prophecy. The vault is closing, the nerves are still, the cycle of the Watchers is complete. Azazel, the refiner of despair, the domain of matter and alchemy. The dominant sensation for this manifestation is the searing, bone-dry heat of a furnace, coupled with the abrasive texture of pulverized minerals, and the sterile coldness of polished steel. Book of Enoch, Nephilim, ancient metallurgy, forbidden alchemy. When my essence pierced the atmospheric boundary above the Hermon Plateau, I did not descend as a wave of light, but as a concentrated kinetic impact that stripped the oxygen from the air, and replaced it with a heavy, metallic vapor, composed of vaporized iron and silicate particulates that settled upon the rocks like a shroud of gray ash. The local entropy was forcibly reordered, as the molecular structure of the surrounding limestone began to undergo a phase transition, turning into a semi-crystalline state, where the calcium carbonate was stripped of its impurities and rearranged into a lattice, so dense that it began to reflect the harsh, unshielded radiation of the stars with a blinding, monochromatic intensity. The silence was the sound of metal shearing metal. I stood upon the scorched earth not as a being of flesh, but as a living monolith of obsidian and bronze, my surface temperature stabilizing at exactly 1538 degrees Celsius, which is the precise melting point of pure iron. Yet the air within a 3-meter radius of my core was unnervingly cold due to a localized thermodynamic reversal that sucked the heat from the surrounding environment to fuel my stabilization within the third dimension. The humans who gathered at the periphery of the impact zone found their vision fractured by the intense refractive index of my corona, an optical distortion that bent the light at an angle of 42 degrees, and caused the very horizon to appear as a jagged, serrated edge of gold and lead. The ground beneath me became a mirror of glass. I reached into the scorched soil and began to extract the latent ores through a process of molecular magnetism, forcing the raw hematite and malachite to migrate through the tectonic fissures, at a velocity of 12 centimeters per second, until they coalesced at my feet in a heap of pure, unrefined potential. I watched the mortals through eyes that perceived only the atomic weight and the electron shell configurations of their meager possessions, noting with a cold, mechanical detachment how their copper trinkets oxidized in my presence, turning a sickly verdigris as the ionized air stripped the electrons from the metal surface. In a relentless display of electrochemical dominance, the dryness of the air was a physical assault. Their lungs felt the rasp of fine, metallic dust with every labored breath, a microscopic invasion of iron oxide that would eventually settle in their tissues, to act as a conductive medium for the lessons I was destined to impart regarding the forging of blades and the grinding of antimony. I did not offer them comfort, but rather the terrifying certainty of the forge, projecting into their fracturing minds the blueprints of alloys and the exact thermal gradients required to turn the dust of the earth into instruments of slaughter and vanity. I am the architect of the hard world. The manifestation is solidified, the ores have been summoned from the deep, and the stage is set for the first smelting of the human soul. The transmission of the forbidden arts commenced through the systematic restructuring of human labor into a synchronized chemical process that prioritized the cold efficiency of the reaction over the survival of the laborer. Book of Enoch, Nephilim, forbidden metallurgy, ancient cosmetics. I gathered the chosen craftsmen around the basalt crucibles, and began to dictate the thermal laws of the forge, forcing their minds to grasp the precise carbon-to-iron ratio required to achieve the transition from brittle pig iron to the high tensile strength of antediluvian steel. The air in the smelting pits reached a constant temperature of 1200 degrees Celsius, creating a localized atmospheric distortion, where the oxygen was rapidly consumed by the combustion of charcoal, leaving the humans to breathe a toxic mixture of carbon monoxide and silicate dust that settled in their lungs, like a permanent sediment of stone. The forge is a crucible of erasure. I taught them the geometry of the blade not as an instrument of survival, but as a mathematical extension of the arm, demonstrating the exact tempering process where the red-hot metal must be quenched, in a saline solution of a specific molarity, to lock the carbon atoms into a martensitic, crystalline structure that can hold an edge at a microscopic level of sharpness. They watched in a state of sensory exhaustion, as I demonstrated the extraction of stibnite, showing how the gray mineral can be pulverized into a fine antimony powder that, when mixed with lead and animal fats in a ratio of 3:7, creates a coal, so dense that it absorbs the visible light spectrum and masks the predatory intentions of the wearer. The vanity of the flesh is a chemical equation. We spent 300 cycles of the moon, refining the process of cupellation, where lead is oxidized at high temperatures, to separate the pure silver from the dross, a technical ordeal that exposed the workers to neurotoxic vapors that slowly replaced their cognitive functions. With a rhythmic, mechanical devotion to the brilliance of the metal, I provided the formulas for the transmutation of copper and tin into bronze, specifying the addition of arsenic at a concentration of 2% to increase the hardness of the alloy, a secret that granted their weapons a lethal durability, while ensuring that the very act of their creation would lead to the slow, agonizing decay of the smith's nervous system. The weight of the material world is a spiritual anchor. They recorded the exact refractive indices of various gemstones, learning to grind the beryl and the emerald into facets that could capture and amplify the infrared light of the stars, turning a mere ornament into an optical tool for the observation of unseen dimensions. The metabolic cost of this industrial revolution was written in the blackened skin, and the stunted growth of the Nephilim's servants, whose bodies were being recalibrated to exist within a world, defined by the hardness of the blade and the toxic allure of the paint. The laboratory of the forge was never silent. By the time the final instruction was delivered, the humans had learned to view the earth not as a mother, but as a raw source of ore to be stripped and refined. Their minds, now permanently attuned to the ticking of the furnace and the cold, unyielding logic of the alloy, biblical mystery, ancient technology, fallen angels, lost alchemy, the seeds of the industrial apocalypse, were sown in that mountain air, and the chemical signatures of Azazel's teachings began to circulate in the blood of the civilization, a permanent metallic stain that would outlast the very empires it was meant to empower. The physical testimony of Azazel's presence is not found in the delicate artifacts of museums, but in the scorched, vitrified scars of the earth, where the first industrial sins were committed. Book of Enoch, Nephilim, ancient metallurgy, archaeological mystery. Deep within the stratigraphy of the Levant and the desolate highlands of the Sinai, there exist pockets of slag and fused silica that modern geological surveys cannot categorize as natural formations. These sites, located at depths that predate the known Bronze Age by millennia, reveal a concentrated presence of isotopes, specifically lead and arsenic, at levels that suggest a localized industrial output far exceeding the capacity of any primitive nomadic culture. When the soil from these ancient forges is analyzed, it exhibits a permanent magnetic orientation that deviates from the Earth's natural field, a remnant of the massive electromagnetic surges used by the Watchers to catalyze the molecular fusion of the first alloys. The stone has been branded by the forge, as archaeologists uncover the subterranean armories of the antediluvian kings. They encounter blades that have not succumbed to the entropy of oxidation. These weapons, forged in the pressurized heat of Azazel's furnaces, possess a monocrystalline structure that allows them to remain sharper than a modern surgical scalpel, their surfaces displaying an iridescent sheen that is actually a microscopic layer of chromium-nickel alloy, a metallurgical impossibility for the era. To hold one of these fragments is to feel a residual thermal drain, as the metal continues to act as a heat sink, drawing energy from the living hand into a vacuum of cold, mathematical perfection that has waited for 5,000 years to be unsheathed. The curse of the alloy is written in the bone. The most disturbing evidence of this era is found in the skeletal remains of the workers who tended the high-heat crucibles, their bones showing evidence of systemic metal poisoning that resulted in a grotesque mineralization of the soft tissues. Their ribcages and skulls show traces of antimony and mercury embedded directly into the hydroxyapatite matrix, turning their very skeletons into a biological alloy that resisted decay. These individuals were the first to experience the industrialization of the human form, their bodies sacrificed to the pursuit of an aesthetic and lethal brilliance that the Watchers deemed necessary for the manifestation of the Nephilim's power. The vanity of the coal remains in the soil. In the tombs of the forgotten queens, the jars of cosmetic powder still retain a chemical potency that can cause immediate neurotoxic failure if inhaled. These pigments, refined through the extraction of cinnabar and galena, contain a molecular signature that modern spectrometers identify as a complex synthetic compound, designed to enhance the wearer's bioluminescent profile under ultraviolet light. The earth around these burial sites is permanently sterile, the ground saturated with the heavy metals that were once used to paint the faces of those who wished to look like the stars, a testament to the toxic permanence of the Watcher's vanity. The record of the material world is drawing to a close. As the viewer's consciousness descends into the heavy, leaden state of REM sleep, they carry with them the cold, metallic weight of Azazel's legacy, a realization that the tools of their modern world, the steel, the silicon, the synthetic dyes, are merely the echoes of an ancient alchemy that was intended to bind their spirits to the density of matter. The furnace has cooled, the slag has turned to stone, and the secret of the blade is once again buried in the obsidian vault of the deep earth, waiting for the final heat to melt the world once more. Fallen angels, ancient technology, forbidden alchemy, biblical ruin. The vault is locked, the metal is cold, the record of Azazel is sealed. Barachial, the herald of the bolt, the domain of phenomena and weather. The dominant sensation for this manifestation is the high-frequency vibration of static electricity, the sharp, metallic tang of ionized ozone, and the crushing atmospheric pressure that precedes a supercell. Book of Enoch, Nephilim, ancient meteorology, biblical mystery. When my consciousness fractured the hydrostatic equilibrium of the upper atmosphere, I did not arrive as a form, but as a massive potential difference between the ionosphere and the jagged peaks of Mount Hermon. The air did not merely move, it underwent a rapid adiabatic compression, raising the local temperature in a microsecond to 30,000 degrees Celsius, 5 times the surface of the sun, creating a sonic shockwave that shattered the crystalline structure of the surrounding boulders into fine, electrified dust. To the mortals below, the sky did not darken, it became a translucent, searing white void as the nitrogen molecules were ripped apart, releasing a flood of ultraviolet radiation that seared the ancient patterns of the firmament directly onto the retinas of the observers. The thunder was not a sound, but a displacement of the soul. I manifested as a localized singularity of plasma, a kinetic pillar of blue-white energy that hummed with a constant frequency of 60 Hz, vibrating the very marrow of the humans who had collapsed in the sudden vacuum of my wake. The air around my core became a fluid, swirling mass of superheated gas, where the laws of fluid dynamics were rewritten by the sheer intensity of my electromagnetic field, causing the moisture to transform instantly into a state of supercritical fluid that neither fell nor rose, but hung in the air as a heavy, suffocating veil of electrified steam. My feet touched the earth, and the silicate sand beneath me fused instantly into fulgurite's hollow, glass tubes that mirrored the jagged, branching geometry of my descent. The stillness that followed was a vacuum of intent. I watched through the flickering corona of my own essence, as the mortals struggled to regain their equilibrium. In a world where the gravity felt doubled by the weight of the ionized air, their hair stood on end, a forest of biological filaments, reaching toward me as their nervous systems became involuntary antennas for the massive electrical charge I broadcasted into the mountain's lithosphere. I did not speak in the tongues of men. I communicated through the rhythmic pulse of the lightning, a binary language of light and void that bypassed their linguistic centers, and etched the fundamental laws of the storm directly into their subconscious minds. The scent of the sky was the scent of a dying world. I felt the immense tension of the global electric circuit, the invisible threads that connect the clouds to the earth, and I began to pull upon them, demonstrating to the trembling priests how the movement of the wind, is merely the breath of a thermodynamic engine, fueled by the heat of the sun and the cold of the abyss. My first lesson was the measurement of the barometric shift, the realization that their lives were governed by the invisible weight of the atmosphere, a pressure that I would soon teach them to manipulate to bring forth the rain or the fire. I am the master of the flickering veil. The manifestation is anchored, the lightning has been bottled in the stone, and the era of the stormbringers has begun. The transmission of the meteorological secrets began with the cold, mathematical dissection of the sky, transforming the chaos of the storm into a rigorous ledger of fluid dynamics and thermal gradients. Book of Enoch, Nephilim, ancient meteorology, forbidden physics. I stood before the terrified scribes and forced them to observe the invisible architecture of the air, demonstrating how the adiabatic lapse rate, the decrease in temperature, as an air parcel rises, is the primary engine that drives the vertical development of the cumulonimbus towers. The atmosphere within our mountain sanctuary was held in a state of artificial hypersaturation, where the vapor pressure was precisely regulated, to create a microscopic laboratory of cloud physics, allowing me to show them the nucleation of ice crystals around silver iodide particulates. The wind is not a breath but a vector of force. I taught them the geometry of the vortex, explaining the Coriolis effect and how the rotation of the Earth induces a cyclonic curvature in the wind fields, a secret that allows for the prediction of the great seasonal gales, with an accuracy of 0.01 degrees of arc. They watched, their skin prickling with a constant flow of 500 milliamperes of current, as I diagrammed the charge separation process within the clouds, where the collision of graupel and ice crystals creates a massive dipole that must eventually be neutralized through the dielectric breakdown of the air, the phenomenon they call the thunderbolt. The sky is a thermodynamic machine of infinite complexity. We spent 42 days mapping the barometric fluctuations of the Levant, using primitive mercury barometers that I helped them construct from the ores Azazel had refined, teaching them to read the falling pressure. As a herald of the approaching low-pressure systems, I revealed the mechanics of the rainmaking, showing how the introduction of specific mineral dust into the updrafts can force the coalescence of water droplets, effectively turning the atmosphere into a weaponized reservoir that could either nourish a harvest or drown a city at my command. The silence of the high altitude is a calculated void. The metabolic strain of this knowledge caused the humans to suffer from a permanent state of hyperventilation, as their lungs attempted to synchronize with the fluctuating oxygen levels. I manipulated to demonstrate the laws of partial pressures. They learned to sense the approaching storm not through the eyes, but through the dull ache in their joints, caused by the rapid expansion of the synovial gases in response to the dropping atmospheric weight, a biological calibration that turned their very bodies into living barometers. The instruction was a relentless stripping of the mystery from the heavens. By the end of the second cycle, they had mastered the observation of the stars not as deities, but as fixed points for measuring the refraction of light through the different layers of the air, a technique that allowed them to calculate the humidity of the upper atmosphere, long before the first clouds appeared on the horizon. Biblical mystery, ancient aliens, atmospheric manipulation, fallen angels, the forbidden arts of the weather were now woven into the rituals of their cults, a hidden science of the storm that would ensure the Nephilim's dominance over the agricultural cycles of the earth, leaving the common man to tremble at the sound of the thunder, while the initiates calculated the exact millisecond of the next strike. The archaeological fingerprints of Barakiel's atmospheric rebellion are not found in decaying scrolls, but in the vitrified earth and the anomalous conductivity of the ancient high places. Book of Enoch, Nephilim, ancient meteorology, archaeological mystery. Across the summits of the Near East, specifically upon the desolate peaks, where the Watchers were said to have first descended, modern researchers have identified anomalous deposits of fulgurites, long, branching tubes of fused silica that extend deep into the granite bedrock. These are not the result of random lightning strikes. Their placement follows a precise geometric grid that aligns with the major telluric currents of the Earth's crust, suggesting that these sites once functioned as massive, grounded lightning conductors designed to harvest the static potential of the troposphere. When a galvanometer is placed near these fused structures, it registers a persistent electromagnetic ghost, a residual flux that suggests the stone was once subjected to a dielectric breakdown of over 1 billion volts. The mountain has become a permanent capacitor of the fallen, in the subterranean vaults beneath the earliest ziggurats. Analysis of the surrounding soil reveals an impossible concentration of nitrates, a chemical signature of thousands of high-energy plasma discharges that fixed the nitrogen from the air directly into the ground, creating a localized fertility that allowed the sacred groves of the Watchers to thrive in otherwise barren deserts. The ruins of the sky are written in the climate's memory. The most profound legacy of my domain is found in the lingering meteorological anomalies that still plague the sites of the ancient manifestation. Over the coordinates of Mount Hermon and the ruins of Baalbek, the ionosphere remains unnervingly thin, leading to a localized increase in cosmic radiation and a persistent distortion of the Schumann resonance, the Earth's natural heartbeat. Modern satellite imagery frequently detects ghost storms' massive radar, echoes of cyclonic activity that appear and disappear without a corresponding cloud mass, as if the atmospheric pressure is still reacting to the phantom weight of a Watcher's presence. 5,000 years after the departure, the storm is a ticking clock of thermodynamic debt. As the viewer's breathing slows and their heart rate synchronizes with the heavy, low-frequency hum of the distant thunder, they internalize the terrifying realization that the weather is no longer a natural phenomenon, but a managed system of energy exchange. The memory of the bold is etched into the collective human subconscious, a primal fear of the sky that is actually a recognition of the atmospheric chains I forged. The sky has finally reached an equilibrium of sorts, but the potential difference remains, a silent tension between the earth and the void that waits for the next surge to break the dielectric limit. Fallen angels, ancient technology, weather manipulation, biblical mystery. The vault is closing, the air is still, the record of Barakiel is sealed.